April 13th, a position seized, prisoners taken, not a single infantry soldier involved. Let that sink in for a moment. For the first time in the recorded history of modern warfare, a military position was seized, held, and its occupants taken prisoner entirely by unmanned systems. No human soldier crossed that line. No infantry unit pushed forward. A signal was sent, machines moved, and the outcome was decided. According to the official announcement from the Office of the President of Ukraine, on April 13, 2025, Ukrainian forces deployed a coordinated combination of aerial drones and ground-based robotic platforms to capture a Russian-held position and take its soldiers as prisoners of war. Zero infantry involvement, zero casualties on the Ukrainian side. Think about what that means not just for this war, but for every war that comes after it. This is not a battlefield update. This is a doctrine signal. And most of the coverage you have seen has treated it like a headline, then moved on. That is a mistake. In this video, I am going to give you a strategic lens to understand why this single event may be the most consequential battlefield development since precision-guided munitions changed the calculus of air power decades ago. We are going to follow the data, trace the implications, and arrive somewhere that most analysts have not gone yet. But first, there is a number buried inside this story that almost no one is talking about, and that number changes everything. Before we go any further, we need to establish the foundation, not opinions, not projections, facts sourced, dated, and verifiable. Because if you are going to understand what April 13th, 2025 actually represents, you need to see the architecture that was built beneath it. This did not happen overnight, and that is precisely what makes it significant. Let us start with what we know. On April 13th, 2025, President Zelensky announced through the official office of the President of Ukraine that Ukrainian forces had, for the first time in the history of this conflict, used a combined deployment of unmanned aerial vehicles and ground-based robotic systems to capture a Russian-held position and take its soldiers as prisoners of war. No infantry, no Ukrainian casualties, a complete autonomous operation from contact to capture. That is the anchor. Everything else builds from there. But here is what most coverage missed entirely. This was not the beginning. It was the culmination. Go back to August of 2024. Ukrainian forces deployed a drone equipped with a loudspeaker to locate and communicate with a Russian soldier who had been abandoned by his unit. That soldier surrendered not to a human, but to a machine instructing him to do so. A single incident, barely a footnote at the time. Then, January of 2025. The Ukrainian robotics manufacturer DevDroid announced and provided video documentation that their ground robot, the TWW 7.62, equipped with artificial intelligence navigation systems, had successfully taken 3 Russian soldiers as prisoners of war. Forbes reported on this directly. 3 soldiers, 1 robot, no human handler on the ground. Then March of 2025. 4 Russian soldiers surrendered to a Ukrainian drone broadcasting audio instructions after witnessing the destruction of their unit in the preceding minutes. Again, documented by Forbes. 3 incidents, 8 months, each one larger than the last. That is not coincidence. That is iteration. Now look at the infrastructure behind these moments. According to Ukrainian Armed Forces Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky, Ukrainian robotic systems completed approximately 9,000 missions in March of 2025 alone. In November of 2024, that number was 2,900. The same period saw the number of Ukrainian military units actively deploying ground robots rise from 67 to 167, according to reporting by Euromaidan Press. Nearly 3 times as many units, 3 times as many missions in 4 months. On the production side, the Interpreter reported in late March of 2025 that 280 Ukrainian companies are currently dedicated to manufacturing ground-based robotic systems. President Zelensky has stated that Ukraine's drone manufacturing capacity reached 4 million units annually by the end of 2025, a figure that originated from the Ukrainian side and should be treated as a declared target rather than independently verified output. Let that architecture sit with you for a moment. 9,000 missions in a single month, 280 manufacturers, 4 million drones per year in declared capacity. This is no longer an experiment. This is an industrial posture. And yet the most important question has not been asked yet. Because scaling a technology is one thing. Turning it into a repeatable battlefield doctrine is something else entirely. That is where this story gets complicated. Here is where most analysis stops, and here is where ours begins. Because the question is not whether Ukraine deployed robots successfully on April 13th, 2025. The question is what that deployment reveals about a shift in military thinking, one that, if it holds, will force every serious defense establishment on the planet to re-examine assumptions they have held for decades. Let us break this down with precision. What happened on April 13th was not a robotic novelty. It was a sequenced, multi-layer operation. Ukrainian forces deployed aerial drones first for reconnaissance, for target confirmation, and for suppression. Ground-based robotic platforms then advanced into the position. The aerial systems maintained overwatch. The ground systems accepted the surrender. From contact to capture, the entire chain of decision and action was executed without a single human presence on the forward line. Military analysts would recognize this structure. It mirrors what doctrine theorists call a kill chain, the sequence of find, fix, track, target, engage, and assess. What Ukraine appears to have demonstrated is that this chain can now be compressed, accelerated, and in certain operational contexts, executed without human soldiers in the forward position. That is a doctrine shift, not a headline, a doctrine shift. To understand the weight of that, consider a historical parallel. In September of 1939, Germany did not introduce a single new weapon that the world had never seen. Tanks existed, aircraft existed, radio communications existed. What changed was the integration, the coordinated use of armor, air power, and mobile infantry at a speed that paralyzed opposing command structures before they could respond. The technology was not new. The doctrine was. Ukraine appears to be testing a similar logic, not because robots are new, but because the integration of aerial unmanned systems with ground robotic platforms into a single coordinated operational unit with no human in the forward position represents a structural change in how ground operations can be conducted. Now consider the 3 layers of pressure this doctrine creates simultaneously. The first layer is psychological. A human soldier facing another human soldier operates within a known framework. The possibility of negotiation, surrender, mutual recognition. A soldier facing an autonomous system has none of that. The machine does not negotiate. It does not hesitate. It does not feel fear. For the soldier on the receiving end, this creates a decisional environment that is fundamentally different and, according to behavioral analysis of asymmetric threat exposure, significantly more disorienting. The second layer is logistical. Ground robots operating in high-risk supply corridors remove human personnel from the most dangerous segments of the resupply chain. Ukrainian commanders have indicated that robotic systems have been used in evacuation and logistics missions across more than 22,000 operations over a 3-month window. Each one of those missions replaced a human exposure to risk. Cumulatively, that represents a meaningful reduction in the attrition of trained personnel, which, in a prolonged conflict, is one of the most difficult resources to replenish. The third layer is the one that will keep defense planners awake at night. It is the doctrinal forcing function. When one side demonstrates the ability to conduct infantry-free ground operations, the opposing side is compelled to invest in countermeasures, electronic warfare systems, anti-drone platforms, signal disruption technology. That investment pulls resources away from conventional force development. It is a budget war fought through battlefield demonstration. Now, here is the observation that most analysts are not making. Track the trajectory of autonomous systems in asymmetric conflict going back to the Nagorno Nagorno-Karabakh War of 2020. In that conflict, the side that achieved dominance in the drone layer defined the terms of engagement on the ground. Armor that had been considered a decisive advantage became a liability without air defense coverage. The lesson absorbed by military planners globally was clear control the drone layer and you shape the ground reality. Ukraine is now attempting to move beyond that lesson. The drone layer is no longer just overhead. It is integrated with the ground. The aerial system and the terrestrial system are operating as a single unit. If that integration can be standardized and scaled, and the production numbers suggest Ukraine is attempting exactly that, then the doctrine being tested in eastern Ukraine today may become the baseline doctrine studied in military academies within a decade. One more thing before we move forward. Foreign Policy, reporting on April 13th, 2025, noted that ground robots in Ukraine cost an average of less than $20,000 per unit to manufacture. A Ukrainian frontline soldier, according to reporting by the New Voice of Ukraine, earns approximately $2,500 per month. By the 8th month of deployment, the robot becomes cost competitive on a pure expenditure basis before accounting for training costs, equipment costs, and the incalculable strategic cost of losing a trained human combatant. 280 companies are building these systems right now. That is not a pilot program. That is an industry being constructed around a doctrine that is still being written in real time. And the most consequential chapter of that doctrine has not been written yet. Because there's a variable on the other side of this equation that almost no one is pricing in correctly. Let us be precise about something. Everything you have heard so far, the missions, the numbers, the doctrine signal, originates from one side of this conflict. Ukrainian official statements, Ukrainian commanders, Ukrainian aligned media outlets. That does not make the information false, but it does mean we have an obligation to apply pressure to it before accepting it as the complete picture. That is not skepticism for its own sake. That is the minimum standard of serious analysis. So let us stress test this narrative. The first pressure point is verification. As of this recording, Russia has not confirmed the events of April 13th, 2025. No independent third-party observer has provided ground-level confirmation of the specific operation Zelensky described. The video documentation that exists for earlier incidents, the Dev droid robot in January, the loudspeaker drone surrenders in March, came directly from Ukrainian manufacturers and Ukrainian military channels. Forbes and other outlets reported on these events, but reporting on a claim is not the same as independently verifying it. This distinction matters when building a strategic assessment. The second pressure point is scalability under real conditions. Ground robots costing $20,000 per unit sound cost effective in a spreadsheet. On terrain that is frozen, waterlogged, heavily mined, or electronically saturated, that calculation becomes considerably more complex. Ukrainian forces themselves have acknowledged that Russian electronic warfare capabilities require software updates to robotic systems on a monthly basis, and that units must perform modifications to their platforms after receiving them, because the electronic environment on the front line changes faster than the manufacturing cycle. That is not a minor footnote. That is a fundamental operational constraint. A system that requires constant software iteration to remain functional is not a deployable standard. It is a technology under active development being tested in live conditions. There is a meaningful difference between those two things, and conflating them produces dangerously optimistic strategic forecasts. The third pressure point is the question that no one is asking loudly enough. Capturing a position is one phase of ground warfare. Holding it is another. consolidating it, supplying it, defending it against counterattack. These are the phases that determine whether a tactical gain becomes a strategic one. The April 13th operation demonstrated that autonomous systems can seize a position. It has not yet demonstrated that they can anchor one. That gap in the evidence is significant. Now consider the international legal dimension. The deployment of systems capable of making targeting decisions with reduced human oversight sits in deeply contested territory under international humanitarian law. The Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons has been debating a framework for lethal autonomous weapon systems for over a decade without resolution. Several of Ukraine's closest Western partners have formally expressed reservations about autonomous systems that operate beyond meaningful human control. If Ukraine's robotic doctrine continues to evolve in the direction of greater autonomy, it may find itself navigating a tension between battlefield necessity and the political expectations of the partners funding that battlefield. And finally, the variable the strategic analysts historically underprice in moments of apparent technological breakthrough: adaptation. In the 1970s, the combination of anti-tank guided missiles and man-portable air defense systems fundamentally disrupted the armor and air power doctrines that had defined conventional warfare since the Second World War. The disruption did not come from a superior army. It came from a cheaper, faster-to-deploy countermeasure reaching the hands of a motivated defender. Russia is watching every one of these operations. Every drone that is jammed, every robot that is disabled, every software vulnerability that is exposed, that is data. And historically, the side absorbing tactical defeats in a new domain tends to accelerate its investment in countering that domain faster than the attacker expects. The drone war advantage Ukraine holds today is real. Whether it is durable is a question that the data has not yet answered. But here is what that data does point toward, and this is the part that almost no financial or geopolitical analyst has connected yet. Here is the part of this story that does not make the defense briefings. The part that does not appear in the battlefield maps, but the part that will show up quietly, structurally, in the economic data that shapes your daily life over the next several years. Because what is being built in Ukraine right now is not just a new military doctrine. It is a new demand signal. And demand signals of this magnitude do not stay contained to the battlefield. Let us follow the chain. Ukraine has declared a manufacturing capacity of 4 million drones per year. 280 companies are producing ground robotic systems. Each of those platforms, aerial or terrestrial, requires semiconductors, sensors, processors, communication modules, the same class of components that goes into the consumer electronics sitting in your pocket, on your desk, and increasingly in your vehicle. The global semiconductor supply chain is not operating with surplus capacity. It is operating under sustained pressure that began with the supply shocks of 2020 and 2021, accelerated through the export control measures imposed between the United States and China from 2022 onward, and has not meaningfully resolved since. Foundry capacity at the leading edge of chip manufacturing remains concentrated in a small number of geographic locations, with Taiwan representing a disproportionate share of global advanced node production. Now add a wartime industrial demand signal of this scale into that constrained system. When military procurement competes with consumer electronics for the same component categories, one of two things happens. Either prices rise across both sectors as suppliers allocate to the highest bidder, or civilian production timelines extend as military contracts take priority. In either case, the cost of manufacturing consumer electronics increases, and that cost does not stay with the manufacturer. It moves downstream into the price of the laptop you replace in 3 years, the vehicle you finance, the household appliances on the next replacement cycle. This is not a forecast. This is a structural mechanism, and it is already in motion. Now move to energy. Reporting by Fortune indicated that Ukrainian drone strikes against Russian Baltic seaport infrastructure affected facilities handling a significant portion of Russian oil export capacity. If that disruption compounds over time through additional strikes, through insurance market responses, through rerouting costs absorbed by Russian exporters, the marginal supply of Russian oil reaching global markets contracts. Oil markets do not require large supply disruptions to produce meaningful price movement. A reduction of 2 to 3% in available export volume has historically been sufficient to produce price responses that ripple through transportation costs, agricultural input costs, and manufactured goods pricing globally. You fill your tank. You pay for freight on everything you order. You absorb energy cost embedded in every product that was manufactured, packaged, and shipped to reach you. Every one of those costs has an oil price input somewhere in its structure. A sustained disruption to Russian export infrastructure is not a story about Ukraine and Russia. It is a story about the price level of your grocery run 6 months from now. Think about what that means for central banks already navigating the tension between growth support and inflation containment. An external energy price shock arriving into an environment of already elevated price sensitivity does not give monetary policymakers more room. It gives them less. And less room for central banks means higher rates sustained for longer, which means the cost of your mortgage, your business loan, your government's debt service, all of it faces upward pressure from decisions being made on a battlefield thousands of miles away. And then there is the longer structural shift. If the doctrine being tested in Ukraine proves durable, if autonomous ground and aerial systems genuinely begin to replace meaningful percentages of frontline infantry requirements, as Ukrainian commanders have projected, then global defense procurement will begin to reorient. Legacy platforms will be reassessed. Contracts for conventional armor, artillery systems, and manned aircraft will face competitive pressure from robotic and autonomous alternatives. That reorientation moves money, large amounts of it, away from established defense contractors whose revenue models are built around platform complexity and towards smaller, faster technology developers whose advantage is software iteration speed and unit cost reduction. For investors, for governments holding defense industry equity, for pension funds with exposure to legacy defense sector weighting. This is not an abstract geopolitical observation. It is a portfolio-level question that is not yet being asked loudly enough in the places where capital allocation decisions get made. The battlefield in eastern Ukraine is a laboratory, and the results of that laboratory are already being priced into systems you interact with every single day, whether you are aware of it or not. But here is what almost every analysis of this situation has gotten backwards. And this is the part that genuinely changes the strategic picture. Let me tell you what the consensus is getting wrong. The dominant narrative around Ukraine's autonomous warfare capability runs in one direction. Ukraine is pulling ahead. The robot doctrine is working. Russia is falling behind and cannot adapt fast enough. The technological gap is widening, and it is widening in one direction only. That narrative is not without foundation. The data we have reviewed supports meaningful Ukrainian advancement in this domain, but consensus narratives in geopolitical analysis have a consistent historical failure mode. They freeze the frame at the moment of apparent breakthrough and project that snapshot forward indefinitely. They mistake a current advantage for a permanent one. And in the history of military technology, permanent advantages are extraordinarily rare. So let us apply pressure to the consensus, not to defend any side of this conflict, but because a flawed strategic picture produces flawed decisions in policy, in capital allocation, and in how we interpret every piece of information that follows. The first contrarian observation is this: every autonomous system Ukraine deploys is also a data collection opportunity for the opposing side. Every drone that is jammed yields information about the jamming threshold. Every robot that is disabled reveals something about its navigational logic, its sensor vulnerabilities, its communication protocols, every software patch Ukraine deploys to counter Russian electronic warfare is, in effect, a disclosure of what the previous vulnerability was. Historically, the side-absorbing early tactical defeats in a new technological domain has frequently been the side that develops the more sophisticated long-term countermeasure. The United States learned more about Soviet radar systems from studying captured equipment than from any intelligence operation. Israel's early losses to surface-to-air missiles in the 1973 Yom Kippur War produced the electronic warfare doctrine that made the Israeli Air Force one of the most capable in the world within a decade. Russia is not a technologically unsophisticated actor. It has a deep institutional history in electronic warfare that predates this conflict by decades. The question analysts should be asking is not whether Russia is currently behind in the drone domain. The question is what Russia is learning from being behind and how quickly that learning translates into a countermeasure that resets the current advantage. The second contrarian observation cuts deeper. Ukraine's robot doctrine is being celebrated as a solution to its manpower deficit. Approximately 2 million Ukrainians are reported to have evaded mobilization requirements, according to figures cited by Ukrainian sources. The autonomous warfare program is positioned, including by Zelensky himself, as a technological answer to that human resource constraint. But consider the inverse logic. A military doctrine built around compensating for a manpower deficit is, by definition, a doctrine built around a weakness. And doctrines built around weaknesses tend to become brittle when the compensating technology encounters its own limitations. If Russian electronic warfare degrades Ukrainian robotic effectiveness faster than Ukraine can iterate its software even temporarily, even regionally, Ukraine does not have a deep reserve of trained infantry to fall back on. The technological layer and the human layer are not redundant systems. They are sequential dependencies. If one fails, the other is already depleted. That is a strategic vulnerability that the triumphalist framing of the autonomous warfare narrative obscures almost entirely. The third observation is the one that should concern the widest audience. Ukraine is not developing this capability in a vacuum. 47 nations are observing these operations with intense institutional interest. Defense ministries are taking notes. Military academies are updating their curricula. And this is the part that rarely appears in Western coverage. Non-state actors with access to commercial drone technology and basic robotics manufacturing capability are watching exactly the same operational playbook being demonstrated in real time on open source video channels. The doctrine that Ukraine is field testing at a cost of $20,000 per ground unit does not require a nation-state budget to replicate at a meaningful scale. It requires component access, software development capacity, and operational patience. All three of those requirements are becoming more accessible, not less, as global supply chains for commercial electronics continue to mature. When military analysts discuss the proliferation risk of autonomous weapons, they typically frame it as a future problem, a regulatory challenge to be addressed through international frameworks and treaty negotiations. What the Ukrainian battlefield is demonstrating is that the proliferation is not a future problem. It is a present condition. The doctrine is already in the open. The unit economics are already published. The operational footage is already available to anyone with an internet connection. The world is not watching a Ukrainian innovation. It is watching a template being written in real time. And the question of who reads that template next and in what context is one that no current international legal framework is equipped to answer. Let that sit with you for a moment. Because the most consequential outcome of Ukraine's autonomous warfare gambit may not be what happens on the Eastern Front in the next 6 months. It may be what a non-state actor in a completely different region of the world does with this operational knowledge in the next 6 years. And that is the question no one in the current coverage cycle is asking. So let us bring this into focus. A new doctrine is forming, not in a war game, not in a think tank simulation, on an active battlefield, in real-time where it The unit economics of ground combat are being rewritten. The threshold for autonomous weapons proliferation has already been crossed, and the international frameworks designed to govern this technology are running years behind the operational reality. Three things are now in motion simultaneously: a technological arms race with no agreed rules, a global supply chain absorbing a new category of military demand, and a template for autonomous warfare sitting in plain view, available to any actor with the resources and the intent to use it. The next move will not come from the front line. It will come from the institutions watching it: defense ministries, technology investors, legal bodies, and actors we are not currently tracking.